You found why we are Christians. My name is Kent Philpott, and we are going to be talking a second time in this program with Dr. Joseph W. Say it.
Bergeron.
Bergeron. I can't pronounce your name, Joe. I'm sorry. Anyway, it's one of the failings common to this model that I get names wrong. But at any rate, we've had a wonderful time. Joe is the author of this book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, written from his medical perspective as an MD and the specialty that he went through in medical school, looking at the crucifixion of Jesus. But we ended the last program and we were talking about Mother Teresa, because Joe had been to India many times, 15 to 20 times, and I just want to ask him, okay, now what Joe did you take away? What did you take away from your visit with Mother Teresa?
Well, as I said, she came out and sat down, and just the two of us talked for, I don't know how long, 10 minutes or so. She prayed for me, I prayed for her. She showed me around the compound. You know, that was a very unusual experience. John Majors, the British Prime Minister, didn't get to meet her when he went there because she wasn't feeling well. Yeah. So, you know, it was a rare blessing that I experienced there. And to be sitting there and seeing the work that she did, the Mother House, the orphanage called Shishu Bhavan, the Home for the Dying, all those things, you had the awareness of her intense intelligence and determination that just didn't always come across on the TV clips that you would see. And but very personable, and just she talked to you like you were her old friend. And I went away from that experience thinking that must have been what it would have been like to meet Jesus. But she had a kind of presence about her that was unusual, and I would describe it as a religious experience, if you can accept it that way. And so I've always had a deep respect for Catholic believers, the Catholic Church. Since that experience, I had no exposure to the Catholic Church, no friends, no nothing. But that experience made me understand that I didn't know everything. That's an important awareness.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And then I visited the Home for the Dying, and something very unusual there is, you know, it's where people are taken in shortly before their death and given some compassionate care. But it's immediately next door to the temple for the goddess Kali. And the goddess Kali was the subject of the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom movie.
Right.
If you remember that.
Sure, I remember.
And 200 years ago, a male child was sacrificed every day at that temple. And today there's goats sacrificed, and people stand in long lines to get in and see the statue. And I vividly remember one person coming out of that temple in hysteria, screaming. Now, in Indian vernacular, Indians would say, the god has entered her. And it was a frightening thing to see, but I think that must be the starkest juxtaposition of good and evil on the planet. Okay. Is the Home for the Dying, and immediately next door, the temple to the goddess Kali.
Okay, Joe, now, we're going to go on the book.
Yes.
We're going to go on the book, and how I got this book, you signed it for me. We were in Anaheim at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, and you were signing a book, The Crucifixion of Jesus. A medical doctor examines the death and resurrection of Christ. How did you get started, Joe, writing this book? What was the motivation for you to get this going?
Well, the medical school in Indianapolis at Indiana University had asked me to lecture, They knew I was a Christian. The Christian group did because I had set up lectures for a missionary surgeon there. And so I didn't know what to talk about. Um, so I thought, well, I'll just collect everything that physicians have written about the crucifixion, and I'll review that and I'll present it to the students. And as I did that, I became perplexed to find out that there was not a consensus among physicians about what Jesus' cause of death was. And in my work doing personal injury, workers' compensation, medical legal work, I don't have the luxury of not knowing what the diagnosis is or not knowing what the mechanism of injury or impairment are. I have to define those things, um, and often often it's not 100% certainty, but most of the time we can make determinations that are medically reasonable, medically appropriate, and medical likely, and the greater preponderance of medical assurance or likelihood. And that's those are the kind of legal bars that legal language that people will use. And I thought it must be that we can review the facts of the crucifixion and arrive at reasonable conclusions of what happened to Jesus more likely than not. And that led, so when I gave that lecture, a retired pathologist came up to me and said, well, you need to write this up for publication, which I did not want to do. That's such an arduous task to do a medical journal article. But I ended up doing that. It took me 2 years to do it. And 6 rejections because medical journals do not want to publish anything like this. And finally got it published in the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine. And then after that, I started giving lectures and so forth. And I thought, well, I can't leave Jesus in the grave. Does medicine say anything about the resurrection? Was the question that I thought about. And not exactly, but when people want to make medical explanations to explain away the resurrection of Jesus, then we can make statements about that. And you may know that, a lot of people that just can't accept the idea of a supernatural occurrence, they'll want to explain away the resurrection of Jesus by saying, well, the disciples went to the wrong tomb. The body was snatched. They perpetrated a hoax. But when you look at the facts and how just doing that in that day would have got you killed, the logic of those kinds of arguments fall flat. So a lot of people have kind of gravitated towards a hallucination hypothesis. Well, maybe, the disciples were hallucinating. And so
Now,
that launched me
stop it
into
on
a study of that
point.
literature.
On that point, Joe, the hallucination thing. Earlier we talked, and on page 187, you say hallucinatory symptoms can be thought of as arising from one of 3 general medical categories: psychophysiological, psychobiochemical, and psychodynamic. You examine those, and I mention that because I think every Christian ought to have a copy of this and be able to see this, because you go through and explain that what is reported in the Gospels could not possibly be a hallucination. We had so many people witness the same thing, and you
Yes.
make a very excellent. You say, could so many different people at different times and different locations have had physical, biochemical, and psychiatric disturbances causing them to have similar, even identical hallucinations?
That's true. As I started to read, I thought, well, yeah, same kind of process of approaching the study. I thought, well, I'll just collect everything that anybody wrote about the hallucination hypothesis.
Right.
I'll read that and see what they said, because I didn't know. So I collected everything that I could find. I think I collected everything. And as I start reading that, I remember one day I was reading a book, and I just threw it on the ground, and I spoke to the book, and I said, "You believe that?" And what was clear to me, what is that people were publishing this book, making a name for themselves, based on the spectacular nature of their assertions, but they're not medical people. And they would make a statement like, well, oh, they were hallucinating and walk away, and that's the end of the story. And no, it's not the end of the story. Hallucination is a symptom. It is not a diagnosis. If someone is hallucinating, you must say, why are they hallucinating? That's the point of this passage you just read in the book. And there's not a lot of things that will cause that. You know, maybe a psychophysiological thing, a brain tumor or something like that can cause certain types of hallucinations. Uh, you know, a chemical derangement, you know, like someone in alcoholic withdrawals has the DTs, you know, delirium tremens, and they'll have hallucinations. But I'll just tell you, those hallucinations are not warm and fuzzy. They're like snakes crawling into bed. They're like elephants walking in the room. They're frightening. And, you know, it's nothing like what the disciples experienced. And then a psychodynamic thing where people are mentally ill and there's intrusion into their conscious mind of things that they see that are not there. You know, these are very sick people in every one of those scenarios. And to say that that explains what the disciples experienced is ludicrous to think of. And that's you know the flawed premise of so much of that writing. I would say essentially all of that writing is that it's not done by medical people. They do not address the underlying causation of such symptoms and how it doesn't make sense. Hallucinations, multiple people seeing the same thing, simply do not occur because hallucinations occur within the milieu of the brain. And everybody's brain is encased in its own separate skull, so nobody shares the same hallucination. Now, some people say, well, you know, maybe it was a group hysteria or mass hysteria, and I address that in the book too. You know, mass hysteria is kind of an old term. We don't really use that term anymore. It's a more modern term would be group psychogenic illness, group sociogenic illness, something like that. But in groups can sometimes have visual experiences that are psychologically mediated. We know that occurs. They're not common, but they do occur. But even in those, the psychodynamic of those groups is very different from the disciples. There's always a sense of excitement, you know, and people are getting worked up emotionally, and then maybe somebody will see someone, and yes, oh, I saw it too, and you know, and I've even talked to people that have had experiences like that. But
Joe, now we're talking about resurrection, but I want to get back to crucifixion in a minute.
okay,
Now, I just want to say that throughout your book, I find all kinds of very interesting things. In fact, my wife Katie was saying the other day that when you read your book, she said, I've read stuff in here that I've never read before, and she's a Master of Divinity graduate. Here's one of them. There are over 5,700 ancient Greek texts with fragments dating to the 2nd century, in addition to over 20,000 ancient manuscripts in other languages. And you go on about that, and the consistency of the story of the resurrection and, of course, the crucifixion. Another thing that I saw that was absolutely astonished is your treatment of your explanation of the temple in Jerusalem, 144,000 square meters. I know this doesn't have anything to do with crucifixion and resurrection necessarily, but how much I appreciated your book. Now, here's the deal. Some people say, which is most important, the crucifixion or the resurrection? Which is most important? And really, there's no answer to that because both are important, absolutely essential. But let's move now to the crucifixion. If I were to have to say which is most important, crucifixion or resurrection, I'd say crucifixion. What would you say?
Oh, that's a hard. They're equal. I wouldn't. I mean, you know, the importance of the death of Jesus is enormous it is the ground zero of all Christianity that redefined God's relationship with humanity. That's what Jesus said at the Last Supper, where I reference Jesus going through the Passover Seder, and he was saying, "This is the new covenant." And the new covenant, I think it's Jeremiah 23, where God says, "I'm going to redefine my relationship with humanity. I'm going to forgive their sins. I'm going to be their God. I'm going to be with them." And that became instituted at the death of Jesus. Well, somebody could say that and raise an eyebrow or two, but if they're crucified and they come back to life, then you know that it really happened. And
Joe,
so both are equally important in my view.
Joe, how would you describe medically the process of Jesus' dying? What did he die of?
Jesus died of traumatic hemorrhagic shock.
Okay, now slow that down a little bit, Joe. Say the word slowly again. What is it?
Traumatic means from injury. Hemorrhagic means bleeding.
Okay.
Shock. And shock is the physiologic effect of diminished circulating blood volume, diminished blood flow to end tissue. And so the description is very clear. And I go through a lot of talk about that in the book, about how Jesus was really scourged twice, traditionally, one in the home of Caiaphas, and then secondly, by Pontius Pilate and his soldiers. And so the tissue damage that Jesus experienced was enormous. And historical references to the beatings of crucifixion are severe, where people's flesh was basically flayed down to the bone. So the extensive tissue damage all over his body would have caused tremendous bleeding, but it also sets up biochemical reactions in the body that cause reactions at the cellular level, that cause acidemia to occur in the body. And Jesus was crucified on a day that was cold.
Say that again.
It was cold that day. And we know that because Peter was standing by a fire warming himself with soldiers that could have arrested him. He lost his sense of safety. He wanted to stand by the fire more than he wanted to stay away from the soldiers. And what happens when you have extensive tissue damage, you have the biochemical effects occurring in the body of acidemia, the depletion of blood clotting factors in the body, and you have hypothermia or decreased core body temperature with hanging naked on a cross on a cold day. All those things congeal or work together to cause an effect. What I propose in the book is what's called trauma-induced coagulopathy, which is an effect on the blood's ability to clot. In other words, it progressively causes a snowball effect where the blood continuously progresses to lose its ability to clot.
Yes.
And so I think that Jesus experienced shock. The description of his death is very clear in that respect. Then when he's walking to the cross, he can't even walk there. He's starting to stumble. He can't carry the short section of the cross. And then he died in 6 hours. Now, people would be on the cross for days. There are literary references of people being on the cross for up to a week. It was meant to kill people in the slowest possible way. There was no injury to vital organs. It was just torture and prolonged torture. But Jesus died in 6 hours. That was unusual. That even surprised Pontius Pilate. And so something was happening in Jesus' body that wasn't happening in the other people that were being crucified with him.
That's true.
So
You're talking about the two others.
The two others were, and
they hadn't been beaten. They
Yes.
hadn't been beaten and scourged.
Well, everybody got scourged, but Jesus was scourged twice.
Yes.
Jesus was beaten. He was charged as a political insurgent. And the Romans were anti-Semitic, and this guy who says he's the king of the Jews, would have heightened their ire, and they would have beat the daylights out of them. And they didn't have it. The Jews couldn't beat anybody more than 40 lashes, but the Romans didn't. There was no limit. They could do whatever they wanted to do so long as they didn't kill him before they got to the cross.
Right.
And so Jesus was taken to the edge of his life before he ever got on the cross. And then the chemical effects that were occurring in his body caused him to die in a rapid fashion that was unusual. In other words, Jesus bled to death because his blood lost the ability to clot. And I think that is consistent with what was occurring with him. It's the factors for that to occur were present. The interesting thing that I think, and I think it's Matthew 25, Jesus tells us, I think he tells us his cause of death.
Okay.
He picks up the cup and he said, "This is my blood in the new covenant that is poured out for the remission of sins." And to me, after completing this study, I read that passage and I thought, oh my God, he told us his cause of death. He bled to death. He
Yes.
told us why he was dying to institute the new covenant, and he told us how he was going to die. His blood was going to be poured out.
Wonderful, Joe. I love that. Now, another interesting thing, you talked about the process of the Roman crucifixion.
Yes.
The stauruo, the post would be in the ground.
Yes.
The prisoner, the condemned prisoner, would carry the crossbeam, right?
Yes.
And I think this is, in your book, it's the first time I ever come across this. I did a little research to check on you.
Oh, no.
Come on.
Did I get it right?
But that it was the Greek towel.
Yes.
The Greek towel. Now, explain that to us, please. Because this is
shape
new.
would be
Most Christians will not have not ever been confronted with this. But I think you're right. I believe you're correct in your analysis. Describe it, please.
Well, the tau cross would look like the English capital T.
Right.
And based on historical reference and literary references of the period, we know that was the shape of the cross that was commonly used. And then there's I don't want to call it the graffiti blasphemo that was from 200 A.D. It was a graffiti of Christian worshiping Christ, but it was blasphemous. They had made a caricature of Jesus having a human figure with the head of a donkey. But it was a tau cross. That's what they used. And if you think about it, if you were charged with crucifying people, it had to be something that could be easily constructed. The vertical section of the cross was permanent and stationary in the ground. The cross section, the horizontal section, was carried by the condemned to the cross. Their arms were nailed most of the time, unless nails were not available, and then they were hoisted up and placed on top of the vertical section with a mortise and tenon joint. And this had to be within arm's reach of the Roman soldiers to put it up there. It had to be something easily constructed, because there were days that they crucified hundreds of people.
Now, Joe, and at our church we have a cross, a regular standard cross, and I understand that kind of cross didn't come in for use for a couple of centuries after the death of Jesus. Is that approximately right?
I don't know exactly when it came into play, but you have to understand that the crucifixes, any artwork that we see about the crucifixion, crucifixes didn't come into Christian worship until about the 6th century, 3 centuries after crucifixion had been outlawed and done away with. So nobody ever saw exactly how people were crucified. We have to go by literary references and archaeological references about that.
So it's okay if we still stick with the later cross, the T shape now, the English T shape. So now there's something I was thinking of, I wanted to get to in terms of the crucifixion. The early dying you explained, the blood loss, and so on and so forth. Now, the Shroud of Turin. You're familiar with that, the Shroud of Turin?
Yes, I've studied it, yes.
Yes. Mark Antonassi, a fellow we know that wrote a book on it, extensive book on it, a lawyer. How do you view the Shroud of Turin? I personally think it is actually the burial shroud of Jesus.
Well, this is a little bit off subject. I have studied it because I've studied everything, and I've lectured on the Shroud of Turin. I view the most accurate scientific discussions to be the writings of Ray Rogers. I don't know if you've read any of that, but I would agree. I would say it this way: the shroud has characteristics of an ancient burial cloth that is undated, but would be consistent with a cloth date that would be between 1,200 and 3,000 years old. It's would be consistent with how Jesus would have been buried. I talk about Jewish funerary customs in the book. He would have been placed in a shroud. He had a cursory, incomplete treatment. He's placed in the tomb. They came back to complete the process, which would have been anointing the body with oil, flowers, and so forth, and then sprinkling that over the body and in the tomb. I referenced the shroud briefly in the book because it played a large part in the suffocation idea that people have promoted about how Jesus died. And pretty much every Easter Sunday I hear somebody give a sermon about how Jesus suffocated. And it really doesn't make sense. I go into a lengthy discussion about why the logic is flawed there. But Dr. Barbet, who wrote his book, A Doctor at Calvary, was a French surgeon, which is a wonderful book, a classic in many respects, yet he's the person that popularized that, which I believe was, not logically supported. Let me just say it that way.
Joe, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being with us. At the end of the program, we'll tell people how to go get your book, The Death of Jesus and the Resurrection of Jesus. That's the core, and this establishes such a reason to see the death and resurrection of Jesus to be absolutely authentic as described in our Bible. Thank you, Joe. All right.
It's wonderful to be with you.
So, Joe, we've reached the end of this second part of Why We Are Christians. Be looking for more programs, interviews of how people came to know Jesus and what happened next. So long.